Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar series, UPTAKE webinar series. We are very happy to have some distinguished guests today to present their research and have a constructive discussion about a very important topic of emission targets and the role of CDR. So I'm just gonna start with presenting a very short presentation about this webinar series and what we are trying to achieve, and then I will hand it over to our guests to have their discussion. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, and yes, so let me start the presentation. Okay, so the monthly webinar series is an initiative that we have started at CMCC and under the project UPTAKE, which is about the carbon dioxide removal technologies and the uptake of these technologies. It's happening every second Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. as now. And the registration is required. So if you have received the emails from us, you know that there is a link there and you have to register and you receive a notification about the event after that. So just a few words about CMCC. So we are a research center in Italy and we have offices all across the country. I'm sitting in Milano, which is our office of the Environmental and Economic Research Center here. Totally, we have about 450 researchers across 3 institutes that on the right side, you can see our institutes there. And we have 3 programs, also cross-cutting programs, integration of planetary, biogeochemical and industrial carbon cycle. I'm directing that program, and this webinar series is also part of that program. Few words about the uptake. We have an extensive program to involve stakeholders, both inside and outside the community who are helping us in this project. So as you can see, there is a QR code here. We have developed an online platform to facilitate the discussion among the interested parties about different topics on CDR. And if you are interested to learn about the project and the outcome of the project deliverables, please scan this QR code and it will lead you to a very short registration form. And after that, you will receive the instruction to join this online platform and interact with our partners. As you can see on the right, these are the partners of the project. And here today with me are some of the researchers involved at Peak Institute in Germany who are discussing their research. So today we are going to talk about separating CO2 emissions from removal targets. The speaker is Anna Merfort. She's at Peak. The panelist is Duncan at Sandbag. And the moderator is Jessica, who is also at Peak Institute. Remember that these webinars are happening every second Wednesday of the month. So for the next one, it will be on March 12th at 2 p.m. If you would like to ask a question during or after the presentation, please use the Q&A box under your screen and send your messages so the panelists and the moderators can see and answer your question. Having said that, I leave it to Jessica to introduce the guests and start the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sohail. Warm welcome also from my side. I'm happy to see so many people joining us for this webinar today. My name is Jessica Strefler. I'm a scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I'm very excited to have Duncan and Anna join us as panelists today. Anna Merfort is a PhD student at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. She studied physics at the Technical University in Berlin and now works at PIC on carbon management and more specifically on carbon dioxide removal. And together with her colleagues, she has already published an analysis on CDR potentials for Germany and will now present her most recent work on separating CO2 emissions and removal targets. Duncan Woods is an industrial decarbonization analyst at Sandbag. He holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Liverpool for his work developing materials for sustainable hydrogen production. And he's now leading Sandbag's research and analysis into decarbonization technologies for industrial processes, including hydrogen, CCS, CCU, and sector-specific technologies. And along with colleagues, Duncan just recently published a policy brief on CDR integration into the EU ETS, and he will hopefully provide a glimpse into the results after Anna's talk, in addition to a reaction to the talk. So we will start out with Anna's talk on separating CO2 emissions from removal targets, comes with limited costs impact, and then we'll have Duncan's reaction and hopefully a brief summary of the policy brief, and then we'll open up for discussion. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Anna.
Yeah, also warm welcome from my side. I'm setting up the presentation right now. Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to present my work. I think the title has already been called several times. So let's dive right into it. It is a publication that is currently under review in Nature Communications, and you can already access it because it's available on Research Square. And I'm going to walk you through, but before I'm doing that, I would like to give, as it is custom, a short introduction into the terminology, just to be sure that we're all on the same page here. So, short introduction. I'm talking a lot about CDR, that is carbon dioxide removal, and I'm constraining myself to, or I'm using the definition by the IPCC report or the State of CDR report. That means it is defined by carbon from the atmosphere or taken up by plants from the atmosphere, so biogenic carbon, that is durably stored, and the removal has to be additional. So we cannot account parts of the natural carbon cycle as CDR because it needs to be caused by dedicated human interventions. And then there's a distinction that is set also by the State of CDR report, that we can divide the plethora of methods to do carbon dioxide removal into two broad categories. One is conventional CDR on land, that is primarily enhancing the land sink, storing carbon in the biosphere. These methods are associated with high maturity and low costs, but they are reversible. So if management practices are changed, or there's climate damages, wildfires, pests, then the carbon could be re-released. And then there's another section that is called novel CDR, and this is going to be the focus of this analysis. And there's also a wide range of methods, but they are right now at low or medium technological maturity and are associated with much higher costs. But in contrast to conventional CDR, they have high permanence. And then there's two more words that are flying around when talking about carbon management. The first one is CCS, so carbon capture and geologic storage. But be careful here, that is indifferent to the source of CO2. So this could be part of a CDR method. So taking up atmospheric CO2 and then storing it geologically, but it could also mean storing fossil carbon. And then there's CCU, where carbon capture and utilization, that means we capture the carbon, but we use it again for fuel or products, and this carbon is not stored away safely, typically. And without further ado, so now that this is set, I want to jump into the reason why you are here, because I'm discussing the separate targets. And the big motivation was that already in the assessment report for 1.5 degrees, so the special report from the IPCC, there is this very central statement that global net zero CO2 emissions have to be achieved in the early 2050s to limit global warming temperature increases to 1.5 degree by 2050 with low overshoot. And that luckily translated into a lot of states and nations pledging net zero targets. So that is a good outcome of that we have now a focal point of how states and nations communicate their long-term climate commitments. That these pledges are so far not, so the scope is not really there and the trustworthiness is not always given. But as we are talking about net zero, what does it actually mean? It means a balance of emissions and removals. So if we avoid as much as we can, and there will be some remaining emissions that have to be compensated by removals. And in this case, so some nations have greenhouse gas targets. That means we need to also offset the non-CO2 emissions. But in this study, I focus on the IPCC recommendations to achieve global net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So then the next question, if we now said, okay, we need to get to net zero, is how much shall we actually avoid and how much shall we offset with removals? And that question, from an economic perspective, is easy to answer because from an economics point of view, emissions should be avoided until it is cheaper to offset the next ton of CO2. So imagine a situation where we have our current CO2 price in the ETS might be $100 per ton, and carbon dioxide removal options are much more expensive. Then it is more reasonable to avoid more until it is cheaper to offset it with carbon dioxide removal. And the argument is that an integrated market for emissions and removals with a uniform carbon price for both activities would deliver this outcome. And another reason for an integrated market might be that legal frameworks and governances specific for CDR are still largely missing. And that might be a reason why experts started already to outline possible inclusions into existing frameworks, because the EU ETS is such a strong pillar of European climate policy, and integrating CDR into that helps bring these technologies forward. But then there are voices that say, well, if we leave this ambiguity open, then this undermines policy credibility. So there's a plethora of scholars that promote the idea of separate targets on emissions and removals to increase trust in climate policy targets, because it enables their independent evaluation. So independent agencies can say, well, this is reasonable, this is not reasonable, and this is desirable. They can stir investments to ensure sufficient decarbonization alongside CDR scale-up. And a big argument is also to prevent mitigation deterrence. So just because we're talking about CDR in the future, it should not undermine emission reductions right now. But another reason why it might not be a good idea to move everything into one market is that there might be environmental side effects associated with large-scale CDR. And if these side effects are not captured by an integrated market, for example, biomass has huge implications for the land system, but that is not part of the ETS. So that might be a reason that the integrated market outcome diverges from the social optimum, where we want to have these side effects incorporated, and separating the targets on emissions and removals could be a means to avoid the overuse of carbon dioxide removal. And now, all of these arguments are important, but given our methodology, I want to walk you through that not everything can be captured by the modeling framework that we are using. In fact, the economic efficiency is a direct part of the output of an integrated assessment model, such as the Riemann model that I'm using. And the model output can inform ex post analysis for environmental side effects. While they might not be fully internalized, we can at least get an idea of how big the impact on the land system is. But then there is the legal frameworks and the policy credibility that are not captured by our model, because we have a perfect foresight model and a social planner. So some kind of these more social constraints cannot really be captured. So this is a word of warning from the beginning. And with that, I would like to jump into what we did in our analysis, moving away from the motivation, going to the scenario design. So as I've already explained, I'm using the integrated assessment model, or in short, IAM Remind. It's an energy economy climate model. And I designed scenarios that achieve global net zero CO2 emissions in 2050. And now the clue of this analysis is that I prescribe gross CO2 emissions that have to be compensated by novel CDR. So to visualize that a bit, I have here plotted in this short dashed line the gross emissions. So how much do we put into the atmosphere? And I prescribe a target in 2050 of 7 gigatons CO2 per year. And then I need CDR to compensate for that, so that if we sum up these two curves, so one is above zero, one is below zero, I get to a pathway that ends up at net zero. And one word what I want to say here, novel CDR, that means in the context of Remind, that is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, DAX, direct air carbon capture and storage, enhanced weathering, and industry CDR. And so the 7 gigatons, why is that the case that I'm introducing the scenario design with? It is the case where the prices on emissions and removals are identical. So we could say the regulator perfectly guessed the market efficient quantities. But then just looking at one scenario doesn't teach us much. So in this analysis, we span a range of scenarios because now we want to investigate what happens if we overstate, or not overstate, but we use more or less CDR to get to net zero and allow for more or less residual emissions. And here I'm spanning the range of 2 to 12 gigatons. And the blue scenarios are the scenarios that go beyond what the equal pricing scenario would deliver. So we have a higher CDR contribution to net zero, and the pink scenarios, so here's also the CDR side of things, and the pink scenarios respectively in the other direction. And what I really want to highlight here, all scenarios reach net zero in 2050. And now, having explained the scenario design, the research question is not so much should targets be separate, but if targets for emission reduction and removals were to be separate to achieve net zero, how should they be chosen? And to answer this question, we are looking at the consequences. Now we're comparing the scenarios that I just introduced. And the first thing I want to jump in is the emission trajectories. I don't know why it's not moving. Here. So what we observe is lower cumulative emissions for more ambitious reduction targets. So the further we want to go down by 2050, the further we have to, or the more we have to reduce the emissions already in the early years. And if you accumulate, if you sum up all the emissions that happen until we reach net zero, then the ambitious reduction targets, so the pink scenarios, perform better and we get better climate outcomes. So lower cumulative emissions translate into lower warming in the end. And the next part I want to discuss is if I move away from the equal pricing from this market efficient outcome, then we get a price split. So we have prices that don't align. And we also took a look at that. So what you can see here in the short dotted line, so going down like this, you have the CO2 price that is necessary to achieve these reduction targets. And on the contrary, scaling up with the CDR target, you get increasingly higher CDR prices that are necessary to incentivize these amounts that I prescribe. And then you can see that the CO2 price is non-linearly sensitive to that. So really bringing emissions further down comes at higher CO2 prices and translates into higher costs. And the next part, so while we are already talking about prices, this has relevant implications on the financiability of CDR. So let me walk you through this a bit. So if you think about equal prices and equal quantities at the time of net zero, so in 2050, all the revenues we get from the residual emissions and their carbon pricing are the same amount we have to spend on compensating that for CDR because we have the same price and the same quantity for CDR. But if we are in a scenario where we're moving away from that, then we do get different quantities. So then we have a price split, and that price split, so the quantity times the price, and then the difference tells you something about the fiscal or financial leeway that policymakers have. And here we also observe, of course, if the CO2 revenues are above the price necessary to incentivize CDR, then we have more financial leeway if the CDR price is below the CO2 price in ambitious reduction targets. And one key argument for having an integrated market is the economic efficiency. So we also take a look at the consumption losses as indicator for economic efficiency. And here it's a bit hard to see. So maybe go to the paper if you want to understand that better. Otherwise, you can also just trust me and my summary that for the 8 gigatons and 6 gigatons, so very close to the optimum, we don't even see consumption losses. And then moving further away from this economic optimum, we observe moderate consumption losses unless we go to extreme CDR scenarios, like here the 12 gigaton scenario has more than 20% additional costs just because we separate the targets. But for the others, the consumption losses are within 0 to 5, 6, 7% additional consumption loss, which might be acceptable in return for the other aspects, like increased policy credibility. And then, because it is an energy systems model, we can also analyze the reaction of the energy system. And this is quite a busy graph, so I'm trying to walk you through how to read it. So here I'm always comparing what changes if we move away from this equal pricing scenario. So I'm plotting the differences to the benchmark scenario. So the benchmark numbers are always in the middle, and then you can see the deviation from it in bars leaning to the left, if they, where's the left? Leaning to the right when they increase, and leaning to the left when they decrease in comparison to the benchmark. And now I walk you through the main findings here as well. So ambitious reduction targets lower our dependency on fossil fuels and geologic storage of carbon. So that is as expected, and that is a clear linear trend that we can observe here. On the other hand, we see that if we go for deeper decarbonization, that comes at higher carbon prices, and also the stronger need to decarbonize the remaining liquids. And we see that high CDR contributions, on the other hand, can prevent strong increases in these liquid fuel prices. And the reason for that is, if we don't allow for compensation by CDR, then the model chooses to produce syn fuels just to squeeze out the remaining fossils from the system, and synthetic fuels are very pricey. And that also explains why we can see here another important parameter that is only taking a look at carbon capture. So how much carbon do we need to capture in the economy? And we could imagine that we don't need that, but instead of storing this in these low CDR scenarios, they have to be used to produce synthetic fuels to decarbonize the liquids. So we are still relying on nascent and probably expensive technologies here. And then one final remark, the biomass demand is also not decreasing with lower CDR targets. In fact, it increases a little bit, and that says because of the increased pressure to decarbonize the economy. So the main takeaway here is that a low CDR target alone might not be enough. I'm skipping ahead of myself. Maybe I wait for my own conclusion slide. So this is a reminder of my motivation slide. So I'm trying to connect the motivation and the results from my paper. So if we take a look at the two things that our model can say something about, the economic efficiency argument, well, we find that economic efficiency losses are moderate for all but the highest CDR contribution scenarios to net zero. And on the other hand, a low CDR target alone might not be sufficient to prevent unsustainable biomass demand. So we can get rid of our dependency on geologic storage of carbon, but a low CDR target does not prevent us. So we need actual specific measures to avoid overuse of biomass. And now taking that back, so now we're discussing how targets should be set. Taking it back to the main question, should CO2 emission and novel CDR targets be separate? Well, as a reminder, our modeling framework is not equipped to answer this question, but we provide important arguments to be considered in the discourse, which is still ongoing. And I've already said that, so I'm not repeating myself here. And then diving deeper, if targets were to be separate, how should they be chosen? So here I'm summarizing the arguments that I provided before. And in total, there are strong arguments for ambitious reduction targets because they lead to lower cumulative emissions, more financial leeway, reduced risk of failure for large-scale CDR, but they come at the expense of higher mitigation costs and higher CO2 prices. So there's always a balancing involved. And then there's one more remark that I would like to make, which is that the flexibility of these targets really depends on the objective. So when we're going back to this slide, why targets should be separate, I mentioned two main lines of argumentation. And if our main goal is to enhance policy credibility, then targets should be decisive and fixed, and they should not be renegotiable, because otherwise they're losing this stirring effect. But on the other side, if our main concern is environmental side effects, then targets should be adjusted and once more knowledge becomes available. So it's not a clear answer to the problem, and it's a multifaceted problem, is what I wanted to say here. And with that, I finished 1 minute ahead of time. And I think I'll leave it to the take-home messages here and hand back to Jessie.
Thank you very much, Anna. I would actually hand over immediately to Duncan for some reflections.
Then I'll stop sharing here, right? And maybe we can pull it up later if we need it.
Perfect. Yes, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate today and for the opportunity to discuss this very interesting report, which was a great presentation there from Anna to take us through it. Because yeah, sometimes it's easy to get bogged down in the detail with carbon removals, I find. So it's great to have these kind of studies that take us back to look at the big picture and think about how CDR should develop overall. So firstly, let me quickly introduce Sandbag. We are an advocacy think tank focused on EU climate policy mainly. So obviously the paper Anna presented has a global focus, so we have to be careful about drawing too many regional conclusions from this global study. But to caveat what I'll be saying, I'll be speaking more at an EU level, so full disclosure there. So the first thing to say is that we are strong advocates for the ETS as an emission mitigation policy, and have been researching and advocating for improvements in the functioning of the EU ETS since its early days back in 2008. So our work on the CDR really accelerated with the announcement that by the end of July 2026, the Commission will assess how negative emissions could be covered within emissions trading in the EU. Since then, we've advocated for separate targets for removals along with other NGOs as part of the Cool Down project, which Fabiola from Carbon Market Watch presented a couple of months ago on one of these webinars. And we've also independently released our policy brief in December, which set out our position on the subject of ETS integration, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But first, coming back to Anna's presentation, I want to highlight some of the kind of the key messages which I took away from the report, as I think it raises a lot of really important points. So firstly, in terms of the separate targets, setting a direction of travel, I think it's clear that setting separate targets kind of sets a clear signal, not only for CDR project developers, but also for the emissions reduction side as well. So also for the pace and depth of the phase out of fossil fuels. So there are really benefits on both sides we see for setting separate targets, which is a crucial point, which is sometimes overlooked when we're just thinking about what's best for removals. There's also an interesting point in the report, which is the fact that over-reliance on CDR is possibly a bit of an easy option for policymakers. So the paper says to avoid societal opposition and smooth out transitional challenges, policymakers would likely rather understate the necessary reduction ambitions and rely more on novel CDR for achieving net zero. So this is something that we should obviously be avoided. We don't want to use CDR as a kind of excuse to kick the can down the road for emissions reductions. And as the paper says, this would lead to a greater risk of missing the climate targets entirely, which is a key point to bear in mind. So this leads into the benefits of keeping CDR as low as possible. The paper mentions there's the strong arguments to set emission reduction targets rather too strict than too loose to avoid emphasizing CDR and underinvestment into low carbon technologies. So again, highlighting the risk of mitigation deterrence, which must be avoided at all costs, really. Also something overlooked, which is the benefits in terms of securing a just transition. So the report states that in the scenario with the lowest CDR, due to higher revenues from carbon pricing and lower overall spending on CDR, there is more financial leeway for policymakers to mitigate regressive effects of climate policies on poorer households or for green investments. So this just transition aspect is something not often mentioned in the CDR debate, and is of course, really crucial to consider. So it's great that this was raised here along with the other key factors to consider. And this is also linked to the final key point, I think, which I took from the paper, which is that a socially optimal contribution of CDR might be lower than the efficient outcome of an integrated market. I would argue that it's probably likely to be lower rather than it might be, but maybe we can get into this debate a little later in the discussion. So for now, I'll segue into kind of talking about our recent policy brief, in which we explore the possibility for integrating removals into the ETS. So the way we looked at it was that it has to be a kind of a two-way street. So the ETS has to be right for CDR, and CDR also has to be right for the ETS. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So first of all, thinking about if the ETS is right for CDR. By this, I mean, will integration of CDR enable it to develop so that it can help achieve the EU's climate goals? And in short, we believe the answer to this is no, at least in the short to medium term. As we know, and as Anna mentioned, CDR is a diverse range of mostly quite still immature technologies. A lot remains uncertain, with MRV methodology still being developed. In Europe, we have the CRCF, carbon removals and carbon farming regulation, which is a good first attempt at certifying removals at government level. But we've seen problems with the draft methodologies, which have been presented for quantifying permanent removals, which were presented back in October at the Carbon Removals Expert Group. There are problems such as zero rating of biomass and counting removals at the point of injection. So there's lots still to resolve there, which we are, as an NGO community, kind of advocating for at the moment. And this is something that has to be in place before integration into a market with reductions is even considered. There's also technological uncertainty in terms of if the full supply chain of emissions is considered with counterfactuals such as foregone sequestration. There are question marks over whether removals are actually achieved from BECCS, for example. There's also questions of accessing storage sites, with the only major BECCS plant in the EU currently not having access to store this captured CO2. So these are really important issues to resolve, and we don't want to excessively incentivize these activities before these uncertainties are still resolved. So at the moment, instead, we think we want to build a portfolio of removals, which we don't believe the ETS is the right place to do. If there are no supply controls in place, then the cheapest removals would be incentivized, which are not necessarily the best, which we want to incentivize. Integrating into the ETS also wouldn't help develop the most scalable and arguably promising long-term method of CDR in DACs, which couldn't compete with the cost of abatement for the next 10 to 15 years, most likely. So we see the benefits of integration are quite limited in terms of helping to mature CDR with environmental integrity. So that's one side of the issue, and then the other side is CDR right for the ETS? By which I mean, will it help the functioning of the ETS in the coming years? So there's a bit of a narrative sometimes that removals are somehow needed for the market to function during the 2030s, but we don't believe this to be the case. And in fact, integration is more likely to disrupt the price signal and could harm the functioning of the ETS. And we show in our policy brief that according to the Commission's modelling, there should be enough surplus to see us through until 2040. But by conducting a supply and demand analysis, around 2040, we should say that the number of allowances in circulation will start to become low. So there are risks of possible market manipulation by larger players. So there could be a role then for integrating removals, which we don't rule out at this stage, and could be an option certainly as we look to achieve net zero. But even then, there are other options as well, such as expansion of sectoral coverage and merging with ETS2 and expanding the scope of the ETS in that way. But as a Commission official said last year, we believe at the moment there's no need to panic about the end of the ETS at the moment, and for now it's really time for the ETS to do its job and to achieve the emissions reductions which it's intended to do. And yeah, we're only just starting now to phase out free allocation for many sectors. Obviously, there are challenges for industry, but we hope the forthcoming Clean Industrial Deal will help support the transition, creating lead markets for low carbon products, et cetera, et cetera. So, but yeah, as I think the paper by Anna and the team shows, we kind of rely too heavily on CDR, and we must be as ambitious as possible with reductions, because the societal and climate benefits are clear for all to see, I think. So for now, I think we need to develop robust MRV as an absolute necessity. We also need some public financing of projects to help demonstrate the removal benefits of CDR at scale. So we're not completely, we don't have an anti-CDR agenda. We still want to see these technologies develop and mature, and we just don't believe the ETS is the right place to do that. And it's time for learning by doing and fully understanding the potential removal benefits and also potential side effects of CDR. So some final thoughts. We recognize the need for CDR to achieve climate goals and see possible integration into the ETS in the long term, around 2040, but believe it is premature to consider this now. We must avoid over-reliance on CDR. Deep emissions abatement is an absolute necessity and the most effective way to meet our climate goals. And as Anna's paper shows, there are many benefits associated with having as little CDR as possible. And it's really imperative that we ensure that removals don't come at the expense of reductions. So yes, we believe the ETS is not the right place to develop the high integrity permanent CDR that we will need to reach net zero. And integration should only be considered from around 2040. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll hand back to Jessica.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Duncan, for these thoughts and comments. Before we go into before we open up the discussion with all the panelists, I would just like to start out with one question to the two of you, because it seems like you both agree that there are at least significant advantages of separating emissions and removal targets, at least in the short to medium term, and that a simple integration into the EU ETS will either not be enough or even counterproductive. So that means that we will need other policies to incentivize the development and deployment of CDR. And Duncan, you already mentioned some of the different objectives, but maybe the two of you could sort of highlight what you think are the most important policy objectives. And given these various policy objectives, we probably need a mix of CDR policies. And maybe you can outline some of the policies that might lead these objectives, or where maybe trade-offs are or synergies. Maybe I would start with Anna and then go back to Duncan.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think the things that we can all agree on, solid MRV is very crucial. So we need to make sure, and we need to come up with MRV frameworks that ensure that if we certify a ton of CDR, it actually leads to climate benefit. And what we also all agree on is that scale up and these policies need to start now, because it will take time for a complete new industry to kick off. And this is not a future problem once we want to get to net zero, but we have to start now. So this is also one of a very important objective. And we have, as Duncan mentioned already several times, we have to make sure that CDR does not compromise emission reductions. One thing that I would like to pick up from the things you just mentioned, Duncan, is as little as possible. I would beg to differ, because we don't stop at net zero. So we may want to get to net negative afterwards. But what I would like to agree on is that we want to abate as much as possible and then see how much CDR we can actually get before compromising environmental side effects. And then what I tried to highlight in my presentation is that objectives for CDR policies can sometimes be contradictory. So if we take a look at legal requirements, for example, so we have, in terms of MRV, what I already said, we kind of have a trade-off between simplicity and low low burden for bureaucracy and legal frameworks versus accuracy. So this is still to be determined. Or the policy credibility, the signaling effect that I mentioned earlier, requires targets to be fixed, while if we are very concerned with environmental side effects, then they should be flexible. And especially for land-based removals, which you didn't cover much, we also have this trade-off between maximum climate benefits, so as much uptake as we can get, while also taking a look at biodiversity issues or other services that a forest could provide. But I don't want to blow up the discussion with this. So these are objectives that are not so, well, at least we have different perspectives and different opinions and different objectives that need to be weighed against each other. And one thing that I would like to mention is the financiability. So who has to pay? And for now, because we need to get CDR through the valley of death, where we have very little market demand, but high investment costs, but CDR should move out of this phase at some point. So best would be to have state aid. Then around net zero, we could think about something like a polluter pays principle. That's why the market integration is so highly discussed. But then for net negative emissions, how do we align that with the polluter pays principle? And will this then go back to state? Does the state need to come up for net negative emissions? And this is also something I think if we discuss optimal CDR policies, we always have to have the full pathway in mind. Where do we want to go eventually? And this is missing in my perspective in this discussion. And I'm also not providing anything in my analysis. But maybe Duncan can be a bit more specific in the answers, because I kept it very broad here.
Thanks so much, Anna. Duncan, please go ahead.
Sure, I can try. I think these are big questions which everyone is kind of grappling with at the moment, but I can try to give our position at least. So yes, I agree that the challenge is that we need to achieve a lot of different objectives, and so a policy mix is likely needed to achieve these different objectives. I think, as the paper states, that economic efficiency isn't everything by itself, and we can handle a small reduction in efficiency to ensure these environmental safeguards, because fundamentally it is about climate benefits and counterbalancing the very last emissions. So environmental integrity is really key. We have to be very careful about creating unsustainable demand for biomass, as the impacts could be very severe. I think we're seeing obviously increasing demand from a host of different sectors, which Anna touched on as well, with increasing biofuels to reach more stringent targets, for example. But there's also chemicals which are using biomass as feedstock, and e-fuel production, etc., etc. So we need to think carefully about prioritization of the use of biomass residues, for example, and kind of factor this into the CDR amounts that we're targeting. So yeah, this has to be the kind of the path forward, I think, to kind of have these clear targets which set the direction of travel, with possibly some room for adjustment, as Anna mentioned. I think, as the paper points out, merely having the separate targets does not guarantee sustainable CDR. So the target has to be kind of based on the sustainable use of biomass. So coming to kind of more concrete an outlook for policy development, I think in the short term, we see the need for more public financing, maybe a specific call under the Innovation Fund for demonstrating CDR at scale would be beneficial, because at the moment, CDR projects obviously are competing with CCS and CCU projects, so it's not easy to secure funding. So that's really important. At the same time, the CLCF methodologies, if done right, can help to improve confidence in the environmental integrity of these removals, and the Green Claims Directive can also play a role there. So these are kind of short-term things which can set the direction of travel for CDR. In the midterm, so like into the 2030s, I think we can look at inclusion of high integrity CDR into the EU taxonomy. We can also start to look at compliance systems, like some kind of removals trading system or such like. Obviously, there are big challenges with this in terms of who the burden falls upon, who are the obligated entities. if the installations are covered by the ETS, then there's a double penalty. And as we approach zero, the pool of obligated entities will reduce. So do we look at the wider economy, historical emissions possibly, but then there's issues of kind of responsibility for removals going forward when emissions are very low. So it's a very complex issue, and we could probably spend a whole hour talking about this alone. But yeah, in the long term, ultimately, we could look at kind of possibly having a kind of economy-wide removal system, which is aligned with the targeted trajectory, which, yeah, as Anna mentioned, we meant to move back towards seeing as a kind of public good in a net zero economy. But I think, yeah, being honest, we don't have all the answers yet, partially because these technologies are still developing and the landscape is still taking shape. Hence the need to kind of prioritize developing a portfolio of solutions through public financing at this stage. So yeah, we need a mix, but we also need to prevent the picture becoming too messy, I think. So it'd be good to clarify the use of credits based on CRCF credits, for example, to avoid issues with double counting, double claiming, etc. So yeah, I think robust integrity is key at this early stage, and also providing that public financing to get the ball rolling and to start demonstrating the benefits of removals at scale.
Great, thanks so much. So by now we've already collected quite some questions here in the chat. And let me start with the most popular one. How do you see CDR in Trump's era? Who would like to take that?
I can have a go. Obviously, our focus is more on the EU side of things, so I'm not an expert on that side of the pond, but I think it makes clear that we need to kind of develop a situation where the business case for CDR becomes almost independent of government policy. It needs to become more economically attractive to carry out CDR in the future. But I think it's obviously the USA is one of the leaders in CDR at the moment. So hopefully the direction of travel has already been set there. But I think in terms of a global scale, I think the need for CDR is recognized, and I hope, well, and I'm sure that we will continue on the path to using CDR to help achieve our global Paris-aligned climate goals.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here. Just hope that tides turn again at some point and people get back to prioritizing climate change mitigation over there. Maybe you have some thoughts as well, Jesse.
No, I think we have a number of questions. I would just, I'm not sure if we, should keep up with one person all the time. So there's another question on are the long-term and distributional justice effects of low versus high CDR deployment somehow considered? I think that's probably for Anna, but maybe it extends beyond just the study.
Yes, so in this study, we have not considered it so far, but there's a lot of work going into this topic right now. So I can assure you that scientists are working on that. And the just transition aspect has many different facets and makes it really difficult. So compromising on the use of CDR means we need to do even more on the abatement side that has its own challenges and could also lead to detrimental effects on the just transition. So it's not a clear picture. So what I can tell you already is that there's no easy answer to it, but there will be very important aspects. And it depends on how we do CDR. So are we allowed in Europe, for example, to use afforestation credits from the global south, for example, that could reinforce post-colonial power mechanisms that we really want to avoid. So there's a lot of aspects that need to play into that. But on the other hand, if remuneration schemes are good, then people providing CDR to other parts of the world could actually benefit from it economically. only given that the environmental risks are contained. So this touches upon a lot of different aspects and a lot of different dimensions. And many people are working on that. So even within our team, but also in the UPTAKE project, and also going beyond that in the community. But we need to wait a little longer to get very decisive answers here.
Yeah, nothing to add from my side. I think that's a comprehensive answer from Anna.
Okay, thanks. Okay, there's one question. I don't know if any of you can answer that. I certainly can't. How can it be effectively ensured that these important findings reach the decision makers or decision-making levels as quick as possible? I think we're doing one part with this webinar, but beyond that, any ideas?
Yes, I think just continue shouting about our research and our advocacy work, and yeah, just getting our research out there.
I also feel that the dialogue is open and that policymakers are actively seeking advice here. So now you all know about it, and you can forward our research, our findings, and everyone engaging in these discussions can contribute in a way, because policymakers are looking for advice.
Yeah, maybe I can add that within the UPTAKE project, we actually have a stakeholder process, and we have the stakeholder forum. And during these, not only in the UPTAKE, but also in other projects, we do get in contact with stakeholders and tell them about our findings. And they tend to be quite interested and would like to be informed. So there's an active outreach in many of our projects. So we do our best to get our data out to the decision makers. The question is then what happens with that. But yeah, we're working on it. Maybe we have time for some more questions. There's one question by Sabine Fuß for Anne. Can you explain again the underlying logic of consumption losses as efficiency measures? Is the underlying logic that deploying more CDR diverts resources from consumption, but then doesn't low CDR imply that we'll have to do more emissions reductions via the demand side as well? So probably the actual question is what counts as consumption loss?
Yes, so from so I was already trying to type it, but then it was too long. So thank you for raising it here. So the technical answer is RingMed is optimizing for consumption, so it can decide whether to invest or to consume, and still maintaining the energy system and providing energy for the demand sectors. So I think the more helpful answer is I'm not actually looking, so all my scenarios have the same underlying assumption on the demand dynamics. So I'm not considering huge shifts in diets, for example, while in the high CDR scenario, I'm not using that. So the underlying drivers are always the same. And then sometimes the model has no alternative but to reduce demand. But that doesn't mean it's a major driver here, but we are actually keeping the background the same and just let the energy system do the job. So that's why in our model, we see more this shift from CDR to synthetic fuels to really squeeze out the remaining fossils and lower our emissions even further. I hope that answers your question. But that is an important point to raise, that demand measures can be huge. So they have a huge impact on our residual emissions, and they should not be overlooked. But it's difficult to think of policy measures that actually induce these large-scale shifts that are necessary to have a climate, to have an impact that the climate can actually see as a benefit. But Duncan, you unmuted yourself. Maybe you want to jump on this as well.
Yes, no, I was about to say a similar kind of thing, that we kind of look at these demand side measures, and I think thinking more about the nature side, natural side of things, and the use of land use. In the EU, for example, I think there are definitely things that could be done there in terms reforming the common agricultural policy and looking at possible integration of kind of carbon farming activities to kind of incentivize that. So yeah, I think it's important to say that in addition to the things covered by Anna's model, there are definitely other options out there to help to achieve reductions which are kind of win-wins for the climate. So these should be prioritized over reliance on CDR in my view as well.
Now,
Right.
I need to take it back because I said overlooked. They're not overlooked. So there's a lot of literature telling you how much of a relief we get if we actually do demand side shifts. But it's not part of my analysis because I need to have, for scientific reasons, a constant and stringent setup. I cannot change it between my scenarios, and that's why I'm not going into this field. Sorry, now I'll take it back, Jess.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. So there's another question. I think it's rather a question of understanding. Maybe goes to Anna as well. How could separating CO2 emission reduction targets from CDR targets enhance political trust and stabilize long-term climate policy expectations?
So the argument here really goes that if we keep this ambiguous and you're an investor now and you have, for example, a steel plant and you don't really know, can you compensate? Can you count on the fact that you can compensate your remaining emissions with CDR? Or do you need to invest a lot into shifting your production to hydrogen, for example, where there's also no infrastructure yet? So there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of question marks on people's minds in these high emission industries. And this leads to the fact that there's an underinvestment in both, might be one of the reasons why there's an underinvestment in both. It's not the sole reason, but sending more clarity can help to guide these, to answer these questions and fasten or speed up these decisions on how to invest, because sometimes it's important to invest and move forward. Because if we wait another 10 years because we don't know what's coming, then we still don't know because we didn't invest. And we delayed it so much that it will not be available in time. I think that maybe that answered the question. I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we can do one final questions, and then I would give you both the option for a quick final comment if you like. So there's one question on biomass. What would be feasible solutions to the risk of high biomass demand and its competition with other land uses and ecosystem functions?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I think, so what we would either need is a comprehensive global policy that really makes sure, because biomass has so many issues surrounding it. So what if we import the biomass? What if we, and all these nature-based solutions, so if you grow your forest, where do you get your wood from? So all of these land impacts can dilute into other parts of the world that are less well regulated, for example. So that's a very tricky thing. And I think we just need to make sure that this is not a very scalable resource. So it plays an important part, but is a niche solution. So it cannot be scaled willingly. Maybe Duncan can.
No, I think that's exactly right. And yeah, I appreciate the use of the term willy-nilly is good. But yes, yeah, as you mentioned before, like there are so many sectors which seem to be kind of independently relying on scaling up demand for biomass, and we're kind of lacking that big picture analysis. There is this cascading principle of use in the EU for how biomass should be used, but at the moment, I think there's a bit of lack of clarity about how it all fits together in terms of future demand and yeah, we need to clarify the kind of sustainable limits of different types of biomass, and to yeah, make sure we're not kind of relying too much on certain types that won't be available in practice, and then have to rely on imports, and that whole issue of yeah, kind of exporting our carbon leakage and these kind of issues. So yeah, certainly important to consider, and has to be yeah, thought about in policy development in the next few years.
Okay, thanks so much. I would love to answer all the other questions in the chat, but unfortunately our time is up. And if you like, you can follow up in the stakeholder forum, and our panelists will do their best to answer your questions there. I'm not sure if we still have time for a closing statement, so okay, then if you like, I would hand over to you for some final remarks, starting with Anne again.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. The closing remarks. I think even though we try to lower the expectations about future CDR availability, we should not underestimate the necessity of it and that we need to start now. So this is really important if we take a look at how fast things can scale. We don't have much time to get to even like when I say ambitious reduction targets, that still means a lot of CDR. So in terms of where we stand right now, but get down as fast and as much as possible with your emissions. Yes, that's my remark.
Thanks a lot, Duncan.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. Yes, well, I've maybe I've overstated the need to not over rely on excessive CDR. I think we do need to act now and to help foster a diverse portfolio of solutions which will help to achieve our climate goals. But yes, I think we need to be careful not to rely on too much in modeling and to avoid over reliance on overshoot as well of our climate targets. And we can't keep kicking the can down the road. We need to reduce emissions now, and this is, I think, the key point of what we're trying to say today.
Great, thank you very much. I think that was a really great discussion. I'm sure we all learned a lot. Thank you so much for providing all these insights and your thoughts and taking the time to discuss here with us. And with that, I would hand over to Sohail for closing remarks, if there are any.
Yes, thank you very much, Jessica, Duncan, and Anne for great discussion and presentation. Hope to see you all next month, March 12th. And with the next presentation, I'm sure we will have a very lively discussion then. Thank you and have a good day. Bye.